All right, Mr. Sapora here, biology class. Welcome to our section on DNA. So, DNA. DNA is one of these things that everybody's heard about, everybody knows about. A lot of people have opinions about how it should be used or not used or what we should do with it. And yet, most people don't really understand even basically what it is or what it can do or what we can do with it. So I think this is a really important one for us to learn about and jump into. It's also a super fascinating one. And although parts of it are complex, the basic sort of what it is and what it does is pretty simple to understand. And I think once you do, there's going to be a lot of, oh, okay, aha moments. Mind blown. We'll see. Okay, so how I start this unit off is we generally have a 2-day class discussion where we discuss some of the, I would say, popular or at least politically sort of charged and relevant topics out there when it comes to DNA. Of course, we're talking about things like medical research, but we're also talking about genetic engineering. These are things that we vote on. Some of these have made it to the ballot box as measures and such. These are things that have gone to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they have voted on. So it's fun to talk about this stuff because I feel like everybody does have an opinion, and you have a right? This is your world, and you live in it, and you have a voice, and you have a vote. So I think it is important for us to understand what it is that we are voicing and what it is that we are voting on and to become informed. So this is a really fun one, and I think an important one for us to learn about. Okay, enough of that. Let's jump into it. So normally the class discussion takes 2 days, and we'll be discussing it at our first class meeting, first 2 discussion questions, and then I'm going to have a second class meeting where we get into the next 2 discussion questions or topics on this. If you can't make those meetings, you can fill out the DNA discussion question handout that I have as a Google document and then submit that for your grade for that particular assignment. But just show up to the class meetings, participate in the discussion. It's much more fun and interesting. Anyway, so I'm going to skip through those discussion questions because they get heated and that's the whole point. Okay, but let's jump into the DNA stuff. So this I break into a couple different sections. This first section that we're doing is just a general introduction to some of the terminology that we hear around DNA. DNA, chromosomes, genes, really those things, and understanding what those are. The next section we will get into what exactly is DNA, the chemistry of the molecule itself, and then we'll get into how does DNA do what it does, right? The function part of it, and that'll be the last section here. I have a notes assignment for this, so after I go through this first video, fill out this first notes assignment, and that'll be your second assignment. Okay, so what is DNA? Well, first off, let's just talk about the word DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. That's a fancy word. So let's say it together. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Yay. DNA. So DNA belongs to a family of molecules called nucleic acids. There's another type of nucleic acid that's out there and also in almost every living thing, and that's ribonucleic acid. And they're very, very close to each other. We'll talk about that later. But it's important to understand that DNA does 3 main things. First thing that DNA does, and the most important, we're going to focus on that today, is DNA makes proteins. We're going to talk about what proteins are in a second, but in a nutshell, proteins do everything in biology. They're the workhorses of the living world. They have many functions. So DNA is the code that makes those specific proteins, and living things have different proteins, right? I have my proteins. This plant has its proteins. We actually share many in common because living things do many things in common. DNA directs the cell's activities. DNA tells your cells what to do, how to do it, and when to do it, right? Some of us are more energetic than others. Some of us are taller than others. DNA is the thing that controls all of that. Not just how we look, but like the activity of our cells, right? Fundamentally, sometimes how we behave. And DNA is what gives organisms their traits. It's what makes this plant a plant and what makes me me. It's also what makes us very similar to each other as humans. We all have human traits, right? We are 99.999% the same in our DNA as humans. Right? We are very closely related to each other, but that small percentage of a difference between us is what makes each of us slightly different from the other and unique. So DNA gives you your traits. it tells your cells what to do, and ultimately all of that boils down to the fact that it makes proteins, and proteins do everything, and they make you. So we're going to learn about that now. Another term that you'll hear when it comes to DNA, right? There's chromosomes and then there's genes. So I'm going to work kind of uphill from there. So DNA is this molecule that is often represented as this twisted sort of ladder. And we're going to unpack that next week, what it's made of, why it's twisted up and all that. And DNA, it exists in really long strands, right? There's actually millions of little steps on this ladder in each of our strands of DNA. So it's incredibly small, but it's also incredibly long. And one strand of DNA contains many different genes. Okay, we hear this term genes, right? Genetic engineering, genetic information. Well, all of that is your genes, right? You are a collection of thousands of different proteins, right? You have all kinds of different proteins that make up your body, but also control your body, right? They're your hormones, they're your blood, they're your antibodies, they're your hair, they're your skin, they're your muscle. And what makes those different proteins, right? Well, the code for that is in the genes themselves. Genes are sections of your DNA, a section here, that is the code for a specific protein. So as you move up and down the DNA molecule, there are different codes on here. This one right here might be the code for one protein, such as hair. And then you move down the molecule, there may be another section here that is the code for a different protein, such as hemoglobin, which is what is in your red blood cells. And then you can move down and there'd be a different protein here, right? Maybe adrenaline. Ooh. Okay. And all of these are called genes, different sections of DNA that code for specific different proteins. And you contain thousands of different genes in your 23 pairs of DNA strands, chromosomes. We're going to talk about that next. Here's what you need to remember and memorize. Genes code for proteins. Memorize this. Say it out loud with me. 4 words. Genes code for proteins. Genes code for proteins. That's what a gene does. A gene is a code for a protein. It is a section of the DNA that is the code for one specific protein. Boom. Okay. We have 23 pairs of DNA strands inside of our cells, so 46 sets. Just like if you had 23 pairs of socks, you'd actually have 46 socks. We'll talk about, why they're paired and all that later. But right now you need to understand this. These are long sections of DNA. So that DNA gets twisted up and coiled up into a structure called a chromosome. Now, I included a picture of this on your note sheet, so you have that there. So run with me here. Chromosomes are big chunks of DNA, all coiled and spooled up. And if you unpack them, then you got the strand of DNA. So we've gone from chromosome to DNA. And then, if you look on that big, long strand of DNA, certain sections have genes. And those genes are codes for specific proteins. So there's many different protein codes on this section of DNA. Chromosomes are long strings of DNA that contain many genes, and they store all of your genetic information. Your genetic information is all of your genes. Gene 1, gene 2, gene 3, gene 4, gene 5. You have thousands, tens of thousands of different genes. The example that I like to use for this is this. This is a book. It's bound together and all the pages are stuck together. It's like a big chromosome. There's a ton of information in here, all of the information that's in here. Now, the DNA is all of these pages, right, strung together here. So this is your big, long strand of DNA in here. And genes are like chapters. They are specific sections, right, in this book that contain specific pieces of information. So one chapter may be to make one protein. One chapter might be to make the hemoglobin protein in your blood. Another chapter over here might be to make a completely different protein, a structural protein, actin or myosin, proteins that make up your muscles. Whoop. Chicken wings, chicken wings. Okay, there may be another protein over here, opsin, which makes up the proteins in your eyes, makes up the rods in your eyes that allow you to see. Thousands of different proteins, thousands of different chapters, right? And then the pages of the DNA, and the book is the chromosome. So, chromosome, the big strand of DNA all wound together. DNA is, right, if you unravel that chromosome, and then if you look down the DNA, you have different chapters, different sections called genes. It's a layer cake, right? So you have to understand the frosting goes on the outside. Okay? Cake doesn't go on the frosting goes on the cake. So the genes are in the DNA, and the DNA is what is wound up to make the chromosomes. Hopefully this drawing helps you make sense of it. Be a good idea to circle on here gene 1 and gene 2, maybe in different color pens. And those would equal protein 1 and protein 2, because genes are the code for proteins. I'm going to say it again and again. It needs to stick. So your DNA is full of different genes. And this is what makes up your genetic information. Your genetic information is your collection of all your different genes. And genetic information is the set of instructions that tells all your cells what to do. So you have a bunch of different genes in your different cell types. You have brain cells, right? And your brain cells have a bunch of different genes. Those make different proteins that shape the cell differently, that make it behave differently. You have muscle cells, and muscle cells have a bunch of different genes in there, sections of DNA, that are making specific muscle proteins. So in your brain cells, you're not making muscle proteins, so those sections of DNA aren't active. We'll talk about that in a second. So your genetic information is all of the different genes telling all of your different cells what to do. And as human beings, we're made of a lot of different cell types. Complex organisms are made of many different cell types. Okay, so I have different types of cells than the starfish does, right? So I have different genes. I have different cell types than this plant. I have different genes. Now, actually, I have more genes in common with the starfish than I do this plant. And the reason being is that I'm an animal, and so is the starfish. So I'm going to move this further here. I get my energy through cellular respiration, so does the starfish, right? I'm a consumer. And actually, there's a lot of other proteins that we have in common as well. This starfish has little light-sensing proteins, similar to like primitive eyeballs. This starfish actually has an endoskeleton, which it makes its little shell plates out of that are on it, similar to my bones, calcium carbonate, all these different things. So your DNA is full of genes, these little sections that make up your genetic information, telling your cells what to do. And each species of organism has different genes, and these are what gives us all our different traits. Now, many genes we share in common. Again, I share more genes in common with this starfish than I do this plant. But actually, I would share more genes in common with this bird than I do this starfish, because this bird and I have more things in common. You may think, what do I have in common with the bird? Well, think, what do you have in common with the bird? What are some of the physical parts of your body, your structure, that you share in common with the bird that you don't with starfish? I'll give you one hint. It's back here. Birds and mammals and reptiles and sharks and fish are vertebrates. We have a spinal cord, a vertebral column. The starfish does not. And with that comes a whole bunch of other traits. We have a brain, right, at one end of that vertebral column. We have eyes. We have these same sensory organs. We breathe through lungs. We have a heart that's connected to veins and arteries, so we have a closed circulatory system, and lots of other things actually in common. The proteins that make up bird feathers are keratin, which is we have a very similar form of keratin that makes up hair and fingernails and claws and things like that. So we share a lot in common. I'm actually 65% genetically identical to a bird. 65% of my genes are the same genes that a bird has. The other 35% are my, human genes or mammalian genes, as the case may be. Kind of cool. And remember, when I'm talking about genes, genes blank for blank. Genes code for proteins. So 65% of my proteins are the same as this bird's, right? I have fingernails and the bird has claws, and they're actually made of the same protein called keratin. Kind of cool. Okay, yeah, that means I'm 65% bird protein. How neat is that? So complex organisms are made up of different cell types. And genes, again, sections of DNA in different cell types, are activated and functioning, right? So in my brain cells, I have certain genes that are functioning. In my muscle cells, I have certain genes that are functioning, making those muscle proteins. And these create different proteins throughout the organism, and these proteins do different jobs throughout our bodies as well. So my liver is making specific proteins to liver functions, right? And so those genes in there are active and making those types of proteins. And this is what gives your cells different looks, features, and functions. And when a gene is malfunctioning, right, then that means that that cell isn't functioning right. It isn't making the proteins that it should make. And many people have different sort of medical issues. And so we can make medicines to treat those issues, but even better, we can start to look at what is going on with the genes and maybe fix the gene itself. So we're not putting a patch on the tire, right? We're actually fundamentally like repairing it from the inside out. And that would be a better form of treatment. Okay, now we're going to talk about proteins. So remember that genes code for proteins. When we're talking about DNA, talking about these sections of DNA called genes, and they code for specific proteins. Why are proteins so important? Proteins are so important because they control nearly everything a cell does. They not only control what a cell does, they are in many ways what a cell is. They're the structural parts of a cell too. So our muscle cells are made of proteins called actin and myosin. We have enzymes in our saliva that speed up chemical reactions, that help us digest food. Amylase is an enzyme we make in our salivary glands that secretes out into our saliva when we smell food or when we're chewing on food, and it helps break that food down. It's a protein that does that, helps us digest. We have signal proteins, adrenaline, right? So if you heard suddenly a loud noise, you would get a rush of this protein that gets released into your body, and it causes all these other reactions, the fight or flight response, right? You get scared. We have transport proteins. Proteins are structures that carry things around throughout our body. Hemoglobin is a protein in your blood that carries oxygen around. Take a deep breath in, and you're saturating oxygen into your hemoglobin proteins, which go through your lungs, through your circulatory system, and go throughout your body. We have structural proteins, again, skin, muscle, hair, tendons, ligaments, cartilage. Sensory proteins. In our eyes, we have this protein called opsin. It makes up the rods in our eyes that allows us to see. And we have defense proteins, antibodies. These will fight foreign bodies like viruses and bacteria that invade your body and destroy them. So proteins do all kinds of things in biology on the cellular level and bigger, right? And linked here in blue, you can click on it, is an interactive that takes you to some of these different types of proteins. And you can just click on these and you could read about them. So there's cool ones like, let's look at defense proteins. Why not? So antibodies battle bacteria and viruses. We also have proteins called fibrin. And these help our blood clot when we get cut. These proteins, when they come, they're in our blood, but when they come in contact with atmospheric oxygen, it causes them to explode into this spider web shape and kind of create a net that will stop the blood from coming out of our body. Pretty cool stuff. So you could click on that and you can explore all of the different types of proteins there. Just a cool link to that as well. And then there's also regulatory proteins. These control our metabolism. Our thyroid makes many of these. And also there's other ones, androgen and estrogen, that teenagers get flooded with at some point in their life that brings the onset of puberty. And so these regulate all kinds of chemical reactions in our bodies as well. Okay, here it is. I want to tie all this together. I want you to make sense of this because there's a lot of vocab here. But again, it's a layer cake, so you want to understand where these terms go in that layering. You and every other living thing here on Earth are made of thousands of different proteins. I have a link to a video on what is a protein. Click on that and watch it because it's good. It's a short one. DNA is the code for these proteins. So I'm made of all these different proteins. What makes those proteins, or what tells those proteins, how to be those proteins? That's the DNA. That's what DNA does. And a gene, what is a gene? A gene is a section of DNA that codes for a specific protein. So I have salivary proteins in here that are coming out, amylase helping me digest food, and I have in those cells certain genes, sections of DNA are making that protein. Over here I have skin, right? So those skin cells, certain cells in there, different genes, different sections of DNA are making those types of proteins, collagen and other things like that to make my skin beautiful. So genes are sections that code for specific proteins, and your body is full of these, and they're all working at different times in different ways. And one strand of DNA contains hundreds or even thousands of different genes, different sections to make different proteins. It's pretty cool stuff. The Human Genome Project mapped all of the different genes in a human being, right? And this was a big, long project that was completed early 2000s. 2003. And it took 13 years, looking at this. And you could scroll down. Each one of our chromosomes, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each one of them contains different genes. And they're numbered in order from 1 to 23. And they number them by the longest to the shortest. So our longest strand of DNA contains 246 million steps or base pairs, which we'll learn about next week. And all along there are different genes. And here's all of the different genes that are on this one. And there's probably many more on here. And these ones are just ones that have to do with genetic disorders, right? So this one here, cataracts. So if there's a mutation or something wrong with that specific section of DNA, that can cause a human to get cataracts. You could go down and just click and link and look at all of the different genes that we have stacked. Pretty cool stuff. There's also a protein database that you can go to. I put a link to that here. They are cataloging and trying to identify all the different proteins in the human body. And there are many, many different types of proteins. And then model them, because proteins have cool shapes. They even have a October molecule of the month. Some serious nerd stuff going on there. It's great. Okay, so for general biology, this is where we stop this week. Okay, I want you to understand these basic things, right? Our DNA is contained in our cells, wound up in chromosomes. One long strand of DNA contains many different genes, and a gene is a section of DNA that codes for our proteins. Proteins are the things that tell our cells what to do, that make up our cells, and that control basically all the working parts of life. And then we're going to stop there. Fill out that note sheet, honors biology. We are going to just keep going here with just a few more slides for you guys. So let's continue on for honors. Okay, so what are proteins? What are proteins made of? We're not going to get into, I'm not going to have you learn all of these different ones, but I want you to just understand a little bit about what they are. Proteins are made of 20 different individual little varieties of molecules called amino acids. Okay, so there's 20 different common types of amino acids that commonly occur in nature. And proteins are made of different combinations of these. In college level biology, you're going to have to memorize all 20 different amino acids, and sometimes you even have to memorize what types of groupings they belong to as well. Not going to do that to you here in high school biology. But DNA is a code for the sequence of amino acids. We're going to unpack this more later in this last section where we talk about how does DNA make proteins, right? The functional part of it. But DNA is a code, and along this code, as you read down a specific gene, the different sections tell you you're going to add this amino acid, you're going to add this amino acid, add this amino acid. And these amino acids can occur in doubles, right? You can get 10 or 20 or 100 leucines in a row, potentially, right? And sometimes it's a big variety. It's a mixed bag. The analogy here is that DNA is a code for the letters amino acid. And the letters make up words, proteins. It's 20 letters to the alphabet here for proteins, right? And so how you combine those amino acids in the different orders and sequences will spell different words. Each of those words is a different protein. Now, some proteins are spelled slightly differently. My hair is different from yours, so I might have a letter or two different in my hair protein word. I might have an amino acid or two different in my sequence there that makes my hair slightly unique or different from yours. Some proteins really have to be fundamentally the same. Hemoglobin in our blood needs to be pretty exact. That word needs to be spelled precisely. Any variation in that, any difference in shape there might cause some mutation that could not be beneficial. Sickle cell anemia is one of those mutations where that hemoglobin word is spelled differently, and so the hemoglobin protein is shaped differently, and so it functions differently and not beneficially to humans. So here's all the different amino acids. You just line them up in a chain, And then once you have a chain of amino acids, that is called a peptid chain. I'm just showing you the same thing here. Okay. Linked bonded amino acids form a peptid chain. So you link up the amino acids, you get what's called a peptid chain or a polypeptid. Polypeptid just means long, many different amino acids, long. And when that peptide chain folds, you take that long string and then you fold it into a specific shape, that is where you get your specific proteins. Proteins have specific shapes for the jobs that they do. And if you want to look back at this protein data bank, what they're mapping here, and when you look at one of these, is in this model, each of these little knobs that you see is a different amino acid, and then it's folded into this complex protein shape here. And here's another one here. And in fact, the green, the blue, and the orange would be different peptid chains. So you can actually get multiple peptid chains folding, and then those interconnect to make an even bigger protein. So now you're talking about something like a compound. And this is where it gets super complex in biology. And this is why I'm kind of saving this for the honors level. I don't expect you to memorize this, but understanding it would be a nice thing. So one gene can make one section of peptid chains and one little mini protein. Another gene can make another one here, another one here. And then those can actually link up into a bigger protein molecule. So even though you may have only, let's say, 10,000 genes in your body, the possibility of certain of those genes making certain proteins that then combine to make a macro protein enables us to have potentially hundreds of thousands of proteins in our body, and we're still mapping that out. We've mapped the genome, and now the push in biology is to map what's called the proteome. You could look that up and Google it, but this protein mapping page is a part of that. And each time they find a new protein, or they kind of showcase, or they really unravel one, then they log them into here, and then they put up a new one every month. Pretty cool stuff. So take a look at that. It's linked. And I believe that takes us right to the end. All right. I even linked an article on protein structures here as well from Nature magazine. So click on that if you'd like to read a little bit more, because why not? And there's a few additional questions on the back side of the note sheet for this week for you guys that have to do with this. All right. Thanks.